there seems to be a deterioration in the Eastern Mediterranean and a radicalization and so on. We figured that one of the most important issues is religious radicalization and populist autocracy, let's say. But in order to address those issues, which are generational almost issues, you've got to first fix what is today. So we figured that we would look at the strategic architecture that is being set up for the Eastern Mediterranean as one leg, and secondly, the bilateral and multilateral agreements that are in the process of being created, such as the East Mediterranean gas forums, etc. But the main point, though, is winning the hearts of, or the battle in the hearts of the people in the Eastern Med and, the littoral states, which is this, the radicalization, which I think you've touched on. That's why we're here to talk to you, because I think you certainly have a grip on what happened in Lebanon and what happened with Levantinism and so on. And I associate Levantinism with a general concept of tolerance and the ability to resist this nationalistic or populist nationalism, let's say, lack of a better term, and which was, I believe, and I think you believe also, and I think Yair also believes this, that this was the bedrock of the civilization of the Eastern Mediterranean, from Roman times, from Hellenistic times, from Judaic traditions, and so on and so on. These are the elements that created this Phoenician concepts of trade and so on. These are the concepts that created what we felt was a sort of a bedrock, as I said, of civilizational attitudes in the Eastern Mediterranean, which, however, at some point began to break down and broke down seriously. Something has gone increasingly wrong, or at least has created the breakdown of this tolerant culture. This is what we want to explore a little bit more with you. First of all, what it is that broke down this, and I know what approximately, what you think, but if you would elaborate. And secondly, can anything be done about it? And how can we essentially address the problems of the next 50 years? Our first question, Frank, is, what went wrong with Levantinism? I mean, what defeated it? What is its arch enemy?
What went wrong? That's a difficult question. I mean, in terms of what went wrong, I think a good part of it is the isms that were mentioned. I mean, the radicalization. But if I can summarize them in two words, it would be two isms. Nationalism.
Before you get there, because there was an issue as to whether the Ottomans had incorporated some sort of Levantinism, and had the Byzantines done that before, or is also empire to blame, or the breakdown of empire, because this is before. I think some of the problems with the breakdown of these concepts preceded the isms.
Yeah. So it's probably the breakdown of empire rather than empire itself, because by its very definition, empire is multicultural, multi-ethnic, multilingual, right? And to a certain extent, the Ottomans recognized the diversity of their place and try to manage it. In certain cases, they try to suppress this in certain areas. But I think they try to manage it by and large with, in equal measure suppression and, as you call it, tolerance. But at some point, in the dying days of the empire, there entered again the idea of ism, nationalism, and from Ottomanism, which was, I don't want to say it was egalitarian, it was probably tolerant, as you mentioned. And tolerance in itself, and I'm going to channel Bernard Lewis here and say that tolerance in and of itself is not a value. I mean, there's an element of condescension in tolerance, right? I tolerate you because I can, and I can withhold tolerance when I feel like it. The Syrian poet Adonis famously said, "I don't want to be tolerated. I want to be equal." Right? So equality is the lodestar, not tolerance, because tolerance is a form of intolerance, if you will. Right. And it's a new value, tolerance, and intolerance is a new vice. And they're born out of perhaps the French Revolution and the Age of Enlightenment and the emancipation of minorities in Europe, and it traveled to the East. But I don't think that empire itself is the problem. But probably the problem is the downfall of empire, because in our case, the Ottoman Empire most recently tried to manage these diversities, and it failed. And again, I'm not offering a prognosis here. I can only offer a diagnosis. And what I've come up with from observing and reading about this region is the rise in the isms, rise of Islamism and nationalism, and I want to make a distinction, not any nationalism. I'm talking about big nation nationalisms. I'm talking about pan-nationalism, right? Like Pan-Turkism, Pan-Turkism, Pan-Arabism, Pan-Slavism, Pan-Germanism. I mean, those are the isms that are noxious, that can get genocidal, and they did. I mean, in the last 100 years, we witnessed at least two genocides in Europe and in our part of the world, and those are due to big nation nationalisms, not small nation nationalisms. As I told someone recently, who was putting all nationalism in the same basket, I told her, in what way is Norwegian nationalism noxious? In what way is it hateful? I mean, it's a small nation nationalism. It is innocuous. It's comparable to patriotism. It deals with a small nation. It does not have ambitions of conquering other spaces and places. It's very tiny, and we did witness, as you mentioned, an age of, and I won't call it tolerance. I will take a chance and call it equality in the Eastern Mediterranean. In the dying days of the Ottoman Empire. And I want to take the example of Alexandria, Egypt, and sort of to juxtapose to the age of cosmopolitanism, to juxtapose the other two isms, Islamism and Arabism. Alexandria is a good example to use for many reasons, not least of which is the name Alexandria, right? This Egypt is supposedly an Arab country, a Muslim country. It has this beautiful port city called Alexandria. It was founded by Alexander the Great, and the name remained for millennia. And traditionally, it had been home for a mosaic of peoples. There's a very old Greek community in Alexandria. There's a very old French community. There's a very old Syro-Lebanese community, Jewish community. So it was a conflation of identities. But ironically, Alexandria also is the birthplace, and today the Quartier Général, if you will, the headquarters of the Muslim Brotherhood. I mean, they were, you know, they were founded in that region, and they got their stronghold in Alexandria, and I believe it remains a stronghold today in Alexandria. And Chris, we spoke before recording about this, about, you know, I mentioned Constantine Cavafy, I mentioned Moustaki, all of these. I don't know if you know, I mean, I'm much older than you, but those names are very vivid in my memory. The French singer Dalida, the French singer Claude François, Georges Moustaki, those are leading figures in French. Guy Béard, the actor Guy Béard, whose daughter is Emmanuelle Béard, those were Egyptians, Alexandrians. Omar Sharif, the famous actor whose real name is Michel Chalhoub. So think about this. Think about what happened to these people with the rise of Arab nationalism. Batior, the independent historian Giselle Ourabi, also known, who writes under the name Batior. She's the author of the Dhimmi, also from that part of the world. French-Israeli author Jacqueline Kahanoff is also an Alexandrian. Arab nationalism, with the coming of Nasser, the Arab nationalist leader of Egypt, completely liquidated this age of cosmopolitanism, this age of Levantinism. And you had these people, these Egyptians, right, had to go elsewhere and had to go pollinate other cultures. So they became Frenchmen, they became Greeks again, they became Americans. And this is, I mean, this is fantastic to sort of, you know, try to trace back such names who were leaders in French literature, American pop culture also. I mean, I often use the example of Frank Sinatra, who has the signature song. If anyone knows what it is, yeah. I'll ask you. Anyone knows what is
My Way?
My Way. I mean, My Way was written initially in French. It's not a Frank Sinatra song. It's a song by Claude François, a French singer who was born and raised in Alexandria, whose family hails from Alexandria. They were expelled, landed in Monaco, and then went to Paris. He wrote the song. Sinatra sort of adapted the song, and the English lyrics of the song's name was Comme d'habitude, as usual in French. So the song's lyrics, the English lyrics, My Way, were written by a fellow called Paul Anka, who is probably unknown to you, but he is also the child of immigrants from Lebanon, who landed in Canada and then the United States. So, so what I'm trying to say is that you suppress the age of cosmopolitanism, you suppress these minorities, right, who were your equals at one time, and they will go on to pollinate other places and other cultures.
Would you agree that there was, after the Second World War, there was an adoption of sort of Western values and Westernism in the Middle East and or to a certain extent in our region. Then came what you could term populist nationalism. But then there's another layer, which is religious radicalism. Populist nationalism and religious radicalism go together, maybe, or maybe not. Certainly there are two elements that have a synergy as far as this development of the unraveling of this tolerant mentality. And then the question is, what can you do about it? Western culture and Western principles and ideals have been, the region has been almost disillusioned with the West for a number of reasons. Partly the West is to blame in many cases. And some other reasons, one of them being the situation in the Middle East and so on. But I think there are these. I have a feeling that, for example, religious radicalism in Islam has more to do than just with the Palestinians. There's something much bigger there. Obviously, the excuse is, well, if Israel was treating the Palestinians properly, then this thing wouldn't have happened, or the Muslims wouldn't be so energized. But I think that's a false statement.
I of course I agree for this reason and for a whole bunch of other reasons also. I personally. And this is not a popular opinion. I don't believe that there's a difference between Islamism and Islam. But I do believe there is a difference between Islam and Muslims. But Islamism and Islam are synonymous. In Arabic, there's no word for Islamism. This is a Western invention. This is, going back to what Yair began saying, sort of, winking at philologists. This is, our inability or unwillingness to name things by their names. So we create sort of like verbal dissimulations or euphemisms, if you will, and we call it Islamism. Islamism and Islam are the same. I mean,
because the West, just to agree with you, the West is looking for moderate Muslims.
Exactly. Because I mean, and again, the West is looking for Muslims who share values with the West, who are Muslims because Islam brings them great joy. But that is a fact. I mean, Islam brings great joy to hundreds of millions of people who want to live a good Muslim life, but it also brings unhappiness and violence and so forth, and those are the same Islams. I mean, there isn't as they say a million Islams. It depends how you interpret it. I mean, it's this is again these are this is bien-pensance and euphemism. You mentioned the importation of the idea of secularism. And again, in Arab nationalism, for instance, Pan-Arabism at its inception was secularist because it was a Western conception, and it was introduced to the Near East by Arab nationalist thinkers who were themselves secular, who were by and large Christians. So the idea of secularism appealed to them not only because it was righteous, but because it was comprehensible to them. They understood what secularism means. I mean, anyone formed in a socialized in a Christian environment knows that there's a difference between church and state. Going back to Jesus himself, exhorting Jesus the Jew, right? And this is blasphemous for a Jew to say, leave unto Caesar what is Caesar's and unto God what is God's. And in some interpretations, this means that, church is church and state is state. They are separate, they are different, and you ought to treat them differently. So a Christian understands that. But But in Islam, there are no terms in any of Islam's languages, whether it be Arabic, Turkish, or Persian. There are no words to distinguish between church and state. Of course, there are words for church and state, but church, the building, but not church, the institution. So at its inception, Arab nationalism was secular and secularist, but it appealed only to Christian Arabic speakers. It did not appeal to Muslims because it was unintelligible. So it had to, in the 1920s and 1930s, it began re-injecting itself with religious symbolism in order for it to begin appealing to the masses of Muslims. So if you look today, at a most superficial level, if you look at the insignia and the seal of the Arab League, if we were to use this as an example, the seal of the Arab League is emblazoned with a Quranic citation from Surat Al-Imran. You are the finest nation, the finest ummah, using again a Quranic term, the finest nation that was brought forth to mankind. Any run-of-the-mill Muslim, half literate, but who knows the Quran will understand what this surah means. You are the finest nation that was brought forth to the world. And this is the Arab League, not the Muslim League. So there's a great deal of conflation in the Arab world, and I like to use quotation marks when I say the Arab world, because I do not believe there is a unified, uniform such world, but that's the term that we use. The founder of the Ba'ath Party, Michel Aflaq, who was a Greek Orthodox Damascene from Syria, famously said, Islam is to Arabism what the bones are to the flesh. So the relationship is a complementary one. It's not, it's not two distinct notions. One complements the other. So that's, that is part of the problem. You have, on the one hand, a civilizational complex, if you will, that understands religion as distinct from identity, and you have another civilizational complex that sees them as the same. And that's what the Levant is dealing with today, and that's why you see sort of the bleeding out of minorities from that region.
Let me probe this point a little bit further. In the West, religious radicalization or Islamic radicalization is a problem of a second-generation Arab immigrants into Europe and the United States, or so disillusionment, etc., etc. And this is how it's addressed. It's addressed as in some ways a failure of the societal support systems, and they can't get a job, and they feel they can't identify with Western values and so on. What on the other hand, what is because there has been a marked radicalization of Islam in the Middle East, but it's not a second generation. It's all of a sudden, what has triggered and what is fueling religious radicalization in the Middle East? Is it, again, it has to do with disillusionment with Western values, but it's not just that. There's something more there. There's a driving force. Is it the funding of religious schools? Is it organized funding by certain countries? Certainly in Europe, there's a whole structure of organizations that lead back to the Turkish Ministry of Religious Affairs. And is this just something that is a development of history, or is it something with a purpose here? There is a smoking gun here.
Yeah, I personally, I'm still debating this issue of, you know, the radicalization of Islam, or, you know, radical Islam or Islamism. I'm still, you know,
or
thinking
it's
about it. I don't know.
the rediscovery of Islam by people who didn't practice it. It's
that's probably a better term, a rediscovery of Islam, sort of going back to the roots. Salafism, if you will, is a term, you know, going back to the ancestors, to the Salaf, to the roots, to the origins, and this, in a way, is perhaps a reaction to the entry of these secularizing ideas into the Near East for the past 100 years. But you asked if, you know, if education has a role to play. I mean, education for the longest time was secularized. And there has been a reaction to it, because traditionally, and this is not, you know, this is not pointing specifically at Islam, education, all education, even in the Christian world, was religiously based. I mean, I was struck visiting universities in London, because I use England as an example, because the English did not or resolved, let's say, their issue with the Catholic Church, whereas the French Revolution, you know, was a revolution against the Catholic Church, and they tried to erase all symbols of the Catholic Church. But all education was religiously based. I mean, in the Middle Ages, a young man like me who wanted to get an education had to join the orders, right? And, you know, become a monk or something. And that's why we still have this tradition. When we graduate college in the West, we wear these funny clothes. And those come from the habits that the priests used to wear upon entering an order.
But in Europe, there's a decrease in religious, the religious character of education. Yeah, in the Middle East, there's a rise.
But that's what I'm saying, and that is, you know, this is attributable to the fact that there is a distinction between church and state, between the here and now and the thereafter in the West, in this sort of Judeo-Christian complex, if you will. Whereas in Islam, to continue along, you know, that line of thinking, in Islam, likewise, traditionally, if you wanted to get an education and you had to be male for that, you entered the kutab, what they call the kutab, what we call madrasa today in Western languages, madrasa. Madrasa literally is a place where you go and learn how to read and write and memorize the Quran. And this was, you know, this was exclusive to Muslim males. Sort of like a bad analogy, but it would make sense perhaps to Yair, you know, what the yeshiva is in Jewish tradition, where you went and you studied the Bible and that's all you did. This was education in Islam. I mean, Judaism is not a good example to use, because Judaism was transformed also by 2,000 years of contacts with Europe, good or bad contacts. So Judaism is somewhat similar and different because it's a national religion. It's not a proselytizing religion. Islam is a universalist religion. And education, if we are to attribute the problem to education or lack of education, education traditionally in Islam has been religious and has continued to be religious. And the problem is perhaps the secularization of education, to which we are witnessing nowadays. Nowadays, I would say, you know, since the 1960s and 70s, the sort of re-Islamization of education, and Europe has been a good target for that. You know, the funding of religious schools, what we call Sunday schools and mosques and so on and so forth, that have perhaps played a role in preventing assimilation of new coming Muslims and the children of Muslim immigration into Europe.
Is there a relation between this, whatever you want to call it, Islamic radicalization in Europe and Islamic radicalization in the Middle East? Is there a kind of a loop there, or are they two separate processes?
No, I personally think it's the same. I think the sources are the same. The intellectual sources, the ideological sources, the religious sources are the same. They may act differently in each place, but the source is essentially the same.
What about the funding?
I'm sorry?
What about the funding?
Oh, the funding is important.
I mean, I don't have figures, but I know that Saudi Arabia has been active in the past century, the late 20th century and early 21st century, in funding what we call radical schools of thought in places like. I'm sorry?
And Qatar is still doing it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's a shift in Saudi Arabia today, but other places in the Gulf are still pursuing this sort of what we call, Salafist and they've entered Western universities. I mean, there's a lot of funding of Middle East studies program, Muslim studies programs that come from big Gulf money. And this is directed at people like you and me, people who teach in these departments and are getting funding with some, I would say, some strings attached.
What about regional universities? I mean, Middle Eastern universities, Muslim universities. Has there been, maybe you know, maybe you don't, additional funding from traditional Islamic sources for such programs, opposed to secular programs, or, for example, the American University of Beirut. Has it changed in any way, or it's close to home for you? And there's another American university in Egypt, and so on. And of course, a lot of Islamic universities and so on. Has the funding? I'm looking for something, concrete, because it's one thing to say that the mood has changed and the historical trends are these and whatever, and it's another to find that there's actually somebody paying for it.
Yeah, I can't speak with any certainty that.
No, I'm sure, but okay.
There is someone, but there is a change. The American University of Beirut has traditionally been a breeding grounds for radical ideas, Arab nationalism, for instance, and that has been, from its inception, this has been the approach of the Presbyterians that funded it. They have been sympathetic to ideas of Arab nationalism and, let's say, Islamism, and that's part of their proselytizing mission, to proselytize among the natives. And to them, they had such a superficial understanding of the region. To them, they thought the natives were all Arabs and Muslims, and they wanted to proselytize among them, so they espoused these ideas. In Lebanon, and you'll see why I'm making this drawing a parallel here. Parallel to this, in Lebanon, in Beirut specifically, there's the Jesuit education, and the Jesuits had a more profound understanding of the region because they had been proselytizing in the region since the inception of the Jesuits, and they understood the area as a mosaic of people, and their approach was to to bring the Christians of the East to the right kind of Christianity, that is Catholic Christianity. So they understood the question of minorities, and they recognized that these peoples are distinct. There are Muslims and there are Arabs and there are non-Arabs and non-Muslims. And traditionally in Lebanon, the USG, the Université Saint-Joseph, the Jesuit University, has been sympathetic to minority narratives in the Middle East, non-Muslim, non-Arab minorities. And the AUB has been sympathetic to the majority, to the Arab Muslim majority. That has changed. So USG no longer today maintains this philosophy. It has been, you know, it's going with this flow of Arabization of Islam, or Islamization, if you will. So it is no longer able or willing or capable to speak with the clarity it did 100 years ago.
Is this how you would explain the reason that the Western's reaction to the destruction of Eastern Christianity has not been particularly vocal in the last few years?
Exactly.
Are these some of the reasons? I mean, there seems to be a very odd silence, you know.
Yeah, so I don't know if I wouldn't say that USG is a reason, but it is a symptom of something much bigger. So this destruction of Eastern Christendom is being met with the silence, and USG, which used to take a stand 100 years ago, 150 years ago, is no longer capable of doing that. Students still make a lot of noise. Some lone faculty voices rise here and there, but by and large, the faculty is no longer capable to speak with such clarity.
But
yeah, here you have questions. Yeah,
I'm reacting a little bit to what you're saying. But if I follow your line of thought, in practical terms, what you're saying is we should find a way, and there are ways to do this, to create pressure on Arab countries, particularly United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, to stop all this incitement education and take a different route and take a different approach. And in the East and in the West, you would need a more effective European policy towards teaching in it. My observation in Germany and Austria is that there is a division. There is part of the Muslim immigrants to Germany and Austria. They want to. They as Frank said, they identify with Western values, and they tend to identify, to cooperate with the Jewish community in a struggle against their own people. Like I've got many friends who do this, so I can tell you, when we speak to Bassam Tibi, who would fall into this category too, and Hussein Ara and some others. So you have on both sides. You have to see how do you work with the people who oppose this Islamic radicalization, and I would say they're potentially very strong. They're not potentially weak. And I accuse the American behavior in Afghanistan in the early 90s, in the early 80s. In the early 80s, of inciting, using Taliban and Muslim radicalism as a way to fight the Russians, and then Saudi Arabia's support for radical schools was very much in line with Washington's thinking, and we pay for stupidities. But if we've learned the lesson, it means that we can come up with some ideas that are quite practical. Am I right or am I wrong?
I mean, I agree, but again, those we're talking on the level of individuals, but institutionally, whether in politics or in academia, institutionally, it's going to be a hard row to hoe. I mean, I always use the example of France, and France, as an idea, as a country, as a history to which the Christians of Lebanon look up traditionally, and as France as the savior, as always this link that will never die. And when in 2020 this horrific explosion happened in the harbor of Beirut, the French president was in Beirut the day after, almost. And this, to many Lebanese, this was, the revival of an old friendship. And look at where he is today. I mean, he made all of these promises to save Lebanon from the grip of Hezbollah, from the grip of Iran, not in those words precisely, but the Lebanese media went head over heels over that visit, and the public and social media. I mean, they really looked at Macron as this, as this crusader from times past coming back to save Eastern Christendom. I'm over exaggerating here, but this is one of the imageries that is recurrent. And, I have to admit, in my own writing on this, I also recall this image. But look at him now. He sort of sold Lebanon for a fistful of dollars, as they say, and trying a rapprochement with Iran, the colonial master of Lebanon, by in actuality. So how that's why I said it's a hard row to hoe. How do you fight this institutionally when you have the traditional, protector of Eastern Christendom, even post-revolutionary France, which was anti-clerical, anti-religious, still saw at least there was an establishment within French society, and that is the military establishment specifically, which remained and remains to this day very firmly Catholic, still believed that they had a mission to those Oriental Christians, as they called them, les chrétiens d'Orient, as they called them in French, which again, Yair, this is going back to what we began with. This is the precision, the Cartesian precision of the French language. They refer to them as Oriental Christians, chrétiens d'Orient, whereas in English, we refer to them as Arab Christians, which is a meaningless phrase, as meaningless as Arab Jews. And you'll understand what I'm talking about.
I don't know. I can tell you a different story, but it doesn't help. It's only, but if you check French, where the ideas of the French Revolution were brought with Napoleon to Spain, to Italy, to Austria, to Germany, to Russia, all of them turned totalitarian and fascist afterwards. The ideas of liberté, fraternité, equality, the moment you get them there, you go with the army in there, they turn exactly into the opposite. So, but this is European history. I understand the
no, but what I was trying to say is that, in the face of Islamic revival, if you will, and the dominance of the sort of spreading of those ideas, what had traditionally been from the European side, what had traditionally been a protector of Near Eastern minorities, namely France, even post-revolutionary anti-clerical France, had traditionally been a protector of Eastern Christendom, is changing course today, is going the way of the majority. So basically sold the few remaining million Christians in the East for a fistful of dollars, for economic deals with Iran. So this is what Eastern Christendom specifically is dealing with, and I want to if I may, if I have a few more minutes left, I'd like to offer in terms of perhaps, and again, I'm not making a prognosis here, just a diagnosis. I'm not a as Lebanese historian Charles Isawi said, I cannot make predictions about the future, only the past. There has been 4 or 5 models, and maybe you've heard me mention this somewhere, since since I'm embarrassed to say you discovered my YouTube channel, because I mix business and pleasure in it. There's a lot of music and there's a lot of serious talk. There have been 4 or 5 models through which these dwindling minorities have been trying to resolve for the past 100 years, I would say, resolve their minoritarian status. In the face of the culprit is the same. We used to call it Arab nationalism. As I mentioned before, Arab nationalism and Islamism complement each other. They've tried to deal these dwindling minorities, I would say, try to deal with their minoritarian status in 4 or 5 manners, solutions. The first one is dhimmitude. So basically, accept your dhimmi status and become a chattel of the majority. And this is the example of the largest Christian minority in the Middle East, and that is the Coptic minority. So they live a devalued existence. The second example is advocating for Arab nationalism and saying, instead of Islamism, there is another ism, and that's Arab nationalism. And it has been so dhimmitude failed because, the Coptic example failed because they're still dwindling. In the early 1950s, before the coming of Nasser, there was one parish of Copts in Egypt, in the United States, not in the United States, in all of North America, Canada and the United States, one parish. Today there are over 200 only in the United States. And this is not due only to natural growth. This is due to immigration. The second example is Arab nationalism, and that is the nationalism of the Greek Orthodox Christians of the Middle East, the Arabic-speaking Greek Orthodox. That has failed because there's no Arab nationalism today. It's conflated with Islamism. The third example, incidentally, and that also has failed, was co-opting the identity of the majority, and that's what the Druze and the Alawites have done. The Alawites of Syria have co-opted Arab nationalism, but they're not really Arab nationalists. They're Alawite nationalists. They want to preserve themselves. The fourth example is the example of Lebanon, trying to create this coexistence between opposites, and that we have seen that has failed. I mean, for all intents and purposes, Lebanon does not exist anymore. It's a basket case. And that is because it tried to create, not out of the many one, as the American saying goes, e pluribus unum, out of the many one. It tried to create out of opposites one. And that's not working. So the idea of coexistence and this confederation of minorities that Lebanon was built upon in 1920 is a failure. The last remaining example that has not failed yet, but that is meeting a lot of pushback, and I don't know if Yair wants to talk about that, is the example of Israel. So Israel said, no, I'm not. So the Jews said, no, I'm not creating coexistence. I don't want to adopt the Arab nationalism of the majority. I'm creating a citadel. a strong state, a Jewish state. A state for others if they also wish to be part of the state, but a state of the Jewish people. And it built this fortress around it. I suspect the jury is still out on whether or not this model is going to survive, given not only pressures of a rising Islamism, if you will, in the region, but pressures also from the outside world. I mean, Israel today has a major PR problem in all institutions, educational institutions, and governments around the world. Am I on the right track, Yair? You think?
And not that I am not that I fully disagree with you. My logic is that we I tend to be optimistic in what I always do, and also, you know, I have another. Don't know how much time I still have to do something, but we're working on cooperation. And one of the models that we are working on, and this is part of what we're doing with Chris, is, you know, we are trying to develop regional structures. There's this EMGF, the East Mediterranean Gas Forum, which we think can be turned into something far more wider. And we would love to see how Lebanon can be part of it. And
yeah, like recently.
And we have on the Red Sea. On the Red Sea, there is a emerging regional structure where where Israel and the Palestinians have to be. Israel definitely has to be part, and we are part of it. Also, we're not an official member. And there is, we had the stupidity of Shimon Peres of the New Middle East, but we have today the opposite thing. The New Middle East failed because it was an Israeli push into the Arab world. But you have today an Arab push, an Arab economic push to the Eastern Mediterranean, which creates a win-win and not a win-lose.
Yeah, and it's spearheaded by Saudi Arabia.
We are trying to work on integration. Now, where I'm an optimist and I don't know, detached of reality, but where you're absolutely right is in the field of education, in the field of the minds of the people, in the field of emotions. We are a citadel, and the stupidity of European governments, and the even greater stupidity of the Americans, and what happens, you know, we saw that, if you note, that the United Nations, they have condemned Israeli activities over 100 times, and not one time China. And there's no humanitarian behavior in China is always perfect, and what we do is in reality self-defense. But you know, the tendencies, there is this tendency. Now we are fighting it. The question is, how much can we fight it together? And I hope that this regional structure building is a way forward. We want to work on narratives and things like this too.
Yeah.
And,
I think the fact that Saudi Arabia is spearheading this movement towards, you know, re-entering history, if you will, for the Arab and Muslim world is very encouraging. And again, you know, to go back to what you began saying, Yair, that, you know, and I make a distinction between this big Islam and individual Muslims. There are very powerful, very clear-throated individual voices in Europe, in European Islam, just like there are in also in the Eastern Mediterranean, that are, you know, speaking truth to power, if you will, or truth to numbers. And recently, a Lebanese parliamentarian by the name of Kamil Shamoun junior, not the older one.
The older one.
Not the older one, a younger one, a grandson, said, listen, and he's very clear-throated about this. We do not have a dispute with Israel, okay? And if we do, it can be resolved politically. We are a civilization of merchants, he said. We sell and buy things, products and ideas. This is how we want to live. And our disputes with our neighbors, near or far, have to be resolved politically. If there are disputes, we don't want war. And if you expect Israel to not respond when you attack it from Lebanese territory, you're dreaming. The response is going to be a very dire one. I'm paraphrasing, but this is the gist of what he said. And again, these voices of whether in the Near East or in Europe, these dissenting voices are very quickly silenced, either by sort of delegitimizing them. And in Lebanon, you delegitimize someone very quickly by calling them a Zionist, or by, liquidating them. And it's been happening. And in Europe, you delegitimize dissenting Muslim voices by apostatizing them. So you call them apostates. Those are not true Muslims, etc. But what is encouraging is that there are voices, and they're speaking with a great deal of clarity, as you know.
But right on this, Frank, look, it's re-emergence of Islam as a political force, in some ways, can be traced to the fight against communism, and it was the answer to the communist ideal. What would be an opposing philosophy to this rising religious radicalization? Could it be patriotism? Because you differentiated between pan-nationalisms and local nationalisms. Would tribalism do? I mean, is there an ism? It's the battle of the isms. Is there an ism that you could fight or that you could juxtapose against Islamism?
I mean, localism is an idea that appeals a great deal to me. I share a lot of values with Arabs and Muslims, but I share a lot of differences with them. It doesn't mean because I share values that I should melt my identity into theirs. And I do think, if you notice, we've tried to point the finger at Western ideas in the beginning and secularism. Among the Western ideas that have infected the Middle East is the state system, which didn't exist 100 years ago, right? There were no states known as Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, Kuwait, etc.
Is statism the answer?
I think, yeah, state patriotism, and it's coming back. And incidentally, ironically, the idea was born with the death of Nasser. Nasser, the champion of Arab nationalism, who was, working for the unification of the so-called Arab world from the Gulf to the ocean, realized at the end of his life that there is no such thing, and that people should work in the direction of cooperation rather than unity. So yes to cooperation. That is exactly what's going on today. And Egypt is for the Egyptians. So just like he made popular all of these unitary Arab nationalist slogans, he made also famous the slogan "Egypt for the Egyptians."
But isn't there also...
maybe the answer is in this Western idea that was hated from the get-go, and that is the state system that has proven to have such a stay in power. I mean, try telling a Jordanian today that Jordan doesn't exist, that it has a no raison d'être, that Jordan is Palestine. They'll kill you. Jordan is the butt of every joke in the Near and Middle East because it is if you want to speak about artificial states, it is the most artificial of all the artificials. I mean, it was created as a consolation prize by Britain to. I'm sorry?
It's a Churchillian idea. It's Winston Churchill.
Yeah. And so, Jordanians would kill today for their Jordanian state and identity, and they swear by it. So that idea is still alive, and maybe that is the solution.
But one of the problems there, unfortunately, is that there's a bit of a problematic interface between statism and democracy. There seems to be a sort of a front there that is or may or may not be reconcilable fully. So there's a liberal democracy has more to do with statism than democracy, than liberal democracy, because there's a threat of a breakdown of a state. So that's another problem. I don't think, I'm not asking for an answer, but it's just, it occurred to me that that's another problem.
You're absolutely right. I mean, and again, the democracy as a set of values, not as a set of processes, right? Not a process of democracy as an election where, you win by 99.99% of the votes, but democracy and that is very important, Chris, because, democracy as a set of values means, yes, elections, but it means also multiple party system, multiple points of power, regular and peaceful transfers of power, protection of minority rights and minority history and minority narratives. So that it's there remains a lot of work.
And the basic of human rights. I mean, that's absolutely the rock base of democracy is the protection of everyone's rights, which again, statism may or may not protect it, but it's like we're using one thing to cure another, and the disease is changing.
But again, I mentioned localism. I mean, statism maybe not in its current configuration. I mean, maybe statism in some state. I mean, Syria clearly has proven that it's not viable together as a state. So maybe a state of the Druze and a state of the Alawites and a state of the Armenians and a state of this and that might be a solution.
Let me be provocative here. We were even sort of joking about an idea of an East Mediterranean Commonwealth. Would that 50 years from now seem like a good idea?
And a Commonwealth does not. A Commonwealth is a model for collaboration, cooperation. It does not denude you of your sovereignty. You do not cease being Israeli or a Cypriot or a Mount Lebanese because that's where I'm from Mount Lebanon. I am not, I was born in Beirut because, that was where all of the hospitals were when I was born. So I had to be born there. But my identity is rooted in Mount Lebanon. So give me a state where, where I can live with people who share my values and I'm happy, to open up to my neighbors and have peaceful, peaceful interchanges and exchanges with them. But the problem, if statism is the problem or is problematic, it is because it's forcing opposites to live together in an unholy matrimony. And despite what the Catholic Church says, an unhappy marriage will end in divorce or in murder. And that's exactly what's going on in Lebanon.
Back to Westphalia, the nation state in a very narrowly defined, is that the answer? Perhaps.
Yeah, but again, not super states like Iraq and like Syria, but smaller states. I mean, interestingly, in the run up to the Gulf War, Joe Biden, who was still a senator then in 2003, said something that that he cannot replicate today because he had such historical literacy at the time, I think. And he said, you know, Iraq is a mess. We shouldn't go there. And Iraq should go back to its origin. The state of Baghdad, the state of Mosul, and the state of Basra. I mean, he understood what Iraq was in Ottoman times. There was no Iraq. There was a vilayet of Baghdad, a vilayet of Mosul, and in the north, and a vilayet of Basra in the south. Syria was likewise. I mean, we speak often about the French and the British dividing the Arab world. And again, the Arab world, they didn't divide anything. At least the French, they kept things as is. So they created Greater Lebanon out of the Ottoman Mount Lebanon. And they sort of normalized the state of Damascus, the state of Aleppo, the state of the Druze Mountain, and the state of the Alawite Mountain, which resembled the administrative divisions under the Ottomans. So essentially they kept it as is, but it was under British pressure that they had to create what we call today Syria. So the British had actually their impulse was unification. The British wanted to create a single Arab kingdom, and the French had the instinct to keep things administratively the way they were under the Ottomans. So even smaller states than what we have today. And that's what I call localism.
What complicates localism is the movements of populations, and for the last century or so, they've been forceful and otherwise movements of population. So they're not the same localities anymore. That's the other problem. Would you not agree?
Yeah. I mean, what happened 100 years ago, and there was a lot of population movements, if you remember, 100 years ago. I mean, what happened between Turkey and Greece was horrendous. 1 million people or more had to change homes, and so the ethnic cleansing that happened 100 years ago is no longer. We have internet nowadays, so this cannot happen.
Yair, would you have questions?
No, the only thing is which we have not discussed is and how much is the need to deal with the upcoming problems of climate change, of desertification of the area, of the lack of water, of movement of people. How much is are these challenges? Will they help or will they cause damage? And the question is, they will probably do both. They can help and cause damage. The question is, what can we do in order for them to channel this into the right directions and not in the wrong one?
Yeah, I think Israel. I don't. I'm not educated enough on this, but I think Israel is on the cutting edge of resolving these problems. I mean, first time I went to the Negev desert, I called my wife, who was here in the States, and I told her, "You won't believe this. I'm in the Negev desert, and they have vineyards." So I think Israel has been thinking about these problems for a very long time. I would say for about 60, 70 years, and finding solutions for them. And I want to say that that this is one of the elements that is leading to a rapprochement between Israel and the Arabs, especially, the Gulf Arab states that, are feeling the brunt of climate change more than we are in the Eastern Mediterranean, and are looking for solutions, and that that may be the answer.
Yair?
No, I maybe tell you something else, but I don't know if this is useful. The difference on God, in Islam there's no difference between church and state. In Judaism and in Christianity, it is what is Caesar's and what is God is God. But in Judaism, you fight with God. The name Israel means you're fighting with God. It is a difficult undertaking. It's not an easy job.
Yeah, and not only you fight, which is something that also exists in Christian tradition, that God created man in His image and His resemblance, which makes not only you fight with God, but that makes you a little God too.
And you're
right?
fighting with yourself. Yeah.
Yeah, because you're created in the image and resemblance of God, and and the idea of God the Father and having children, and that is anathema in Islam. So there's no such thing as God the Father. God does not have children.
Frank, thank you very much. We took more of your time than we hope. It was constructive, though, for you also.
It was educational, constructive, and on a personal level, pure pleasure to.
Thank you.
For me, I learned a lot, and I'm quite grateful for the discussion.